In a world where equality should be a given, there are still those who judge others by the color of their skin. But what happens when the tables turn, and those who abuse their power are faced with the truth? Brace yourself for a story of justice, where one woman's fight for racial equality exposes the darkness within a system meant to protect us all. It was a biting October morning in downtown Chicago, the chill of the wind cutting through the thickest of coats. The city was bustling as usual, commuters crammed onto trains, coffee shops overflowing with patrons, the constant hum of taxis and buses in motion. But for Tanya Johnson, this was no ordinary day. Her nerves were steady, her heartbeat calm. She had been through worse before, yet nothing quite like what she was about to face. As she moved through the streets, her worn hoodie pulled tight around her face, and her faded jeans loose at the knees, Tanya blended seamlessly with the crowd. To anyone who looked at her, she was just another face in the city, an ordinary black woman, but beneath the surface lay a truth that would send shockwaves through the Chicago Police Department. Tanya wasn't just any woman, she was an undercover internal affairs agent, and she was on a mission to expose the corruption festering inside the precinct. The assignment had come directly from the top. For months, there had been growing reports of racial discrimination, violence, and corruption within the 12th precinct. Citizens had filed complaints, evidence had been ignored, and whispers of a racist culture among some officers had reached a deafening level. It was time for someone to go in undercover and gather hard proof. The city's faith in its police force was teetering on the edge of collapse. The department needed a reckoning, and Tanya Johnson was the woman for the job. As she approached the precinct parking lot, she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. It wasn't the first time she'd gone undercover, but this mission felt different. This was about more than just exposing bad cops. It was about confronting a system of racism that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. Leaning against their patrol cars in the parking lot were a group of white officers, smoking and laughing, their uniforms spotless, their boots polished to a gleam. They looked up as Tanya approached, their eyes narrowing as they took her in. She could feel their judgment, their disdain, before they even opened their mouths. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Officer Rick Miller, a man notorious for his brutal tactics, particularly in minority communities, stepped forward, a slow grin spreading across his face. He was a towering figure, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a rough, commanding presence. He sauntered toward Tanya, his hand resting on the baton hanging from his belt. "You lost or something," he sneered, his eyes cold as they roamed over her. "You don't look like you belong around here." Tanya said nothing, keeping her face neutral. She had learned long ago how to remain calm in the face of provocation. Her pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, knowing that every word, every sneer, was being recorded by the hidden body cam nestled under her hoodie. Miller didn't back down. "I'm talking to you, girl," he spat, his voice growing louder, more aggressive. His buddies had begun to gather behind him, snickering and muttering among themselves. One of them, a wiry man with a buzz cut, leaned over to another officer and muttered, "Looks like she wandered in from the wrong side of town." Tanya held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She knew what they wanted her to react, to get angry, to give them an excuse. But she wouldn't. Not today. Miller smirked, clearly frustrated by her silence. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his hand now gripping the baton at his side. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Tanya's heart raced, but she knew this was all part of the game. Let them think they had the upper hand, let them reveal their true colors. She could take it, because soon, she would take them down. After what felt like an eternity, Miller finally backed off. With a final sneer, he turned and rejoined his group, the laughter and jokes resuming as if nothing had happened. Tanya exhaled slowly, her fists unclenching. The encounter was over, but the mission was just beginning. That evening, Tanya sat in a dimly lit motel room, her laptop glowing in the darkness. The footage from her body cam played on the screen, capturing every word, every sneer, every insult, the casual racism, the arrogance. It was all there, but she needed more. This wasn't just about one bad cop, it was about an entire system that needed to be exposed. The precinct was rotten, and she was going to prove it. The following day, Tanya returned to the 12th precinct, this time dressed even more casually than before. Her jeans were frayed, her sneakers worn, and her hoodie had holes in the sleeves. She was invisible to them, just another black woman they could dismiss and mistreat. But Tanya had her eyes on a bigger prize. Today, she wasn't just observing, she was baiting them, pushing for more proof. As she entered the parking lot again, Officer Miller spotted her immediately. His smirk was even bigger today, his arrogance more pronounced. "Back again, huh?" he said, swaggering over with his usual crew in tow. "Don't you people ever learn?" Tanya's stomach churned at the words, but she remained calm. She knew the game, knew how to play her part. She wasn't there to argue or fight back, she was there to gather evidence that would finally bring these men to justice. Miller's taunts grew worse, his voice louder and more condescending with every word. He poked fun at her clothes, her appearance, made degrading remarks about her race. Tanya stood there, absorbing it all, her body cam catching every second of the vile treatment. It was everything she needed. 3 days later, everything changed. Tanya walked into the precinct, but this time, she wasn't alone. Flanked by her internal affairs team, she strode confidently through the front doors, her badge visible for the first time. The officers lounging in the lobby looked up, confused at the sight of her, but their confusion quickly turned to shock as they realized what was happening. "Tanya Johnson, Internal Affairs," she said, flashing her badge for all to see. The room fell silent. The officers who had mocked her, who had spewed hate in her direction just days ago, now stared at her in disbelief. Officer Miller, standing by the coffee machine, froze in place as he saw her, his face turning ashen, the smug confidence draining away as the reality of the situation hit him. He stumbled over his words, trying to form a sentence, but it was too late. "We're here to arrest Officer Rick Miller," Tanya said, her voice steady, commanding. The Internal Affairs agents stepped forward, surrounding him. Miller's eyes darted around the room, looking for help, but no one moved. His fellow officers, the ones who had laughed at his jokes, now stayed silent. One of the agents slapped the cuffs on Miller's wrists as he stammered protests, but it didn't matter. His fate was sealed. As he was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, the news vans outside captured every moment. Tanya followed behind, her face impassive. She wasn't here for revenge, she was here for justice. But as the camera zoomed in on her, she couldn't deny the sense of triumph swelling in her chest. The officers who had despised her, who had looked down on her, had no idea who she really was, and now, they would never forget. The ripple effects of Tanya's investigation were felt throughout the city. In the days that followed, more arrests were made, and more officers were implicated. The scandal rocked the police department, with high-ranking officials forced to resign and an internal review launched into the entire precinct's operations. Tanya's actions had set off a chain reaction, one that would lead to systemic changes in the department. For the first time in years, the people of Chicago felt like justice was within reach. For Tanya, it was more than just another case closed. It was personal. She had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood these officers patrolled, had seen the way people like her were treated by those sworn to protect them. Now, she had the power to change that, to hold those in power accountable for their actions. As she stood on the steps of the precinct, watching the chaos unfold, Tanya knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the tide was turning. Tanya Johnson had been just another face in the crowd, invisible to those who judged her. But now, she was a hero, and the city would never forget her name.